The story of William H. Brushy Bill Roberts entered the public dialogue in 1950, and since that time it has endured for more than 70 years. Critics will tell you that Brushy Bill Roberts is an old fraud, and that his story has been disproven long ago. When confronted with evidence supporting Mr. Roberts' claim, they are incredulous and dismissive, suggesting that the person who presents that evidence is either a fraud, an idiot, or just someone out to make a quick buck. Truth, it seems, only has the meaning that they are willing to give it, and if they decide that Brushy didn't look anything like Billy the Kid, or that he was too young, or that Mr. Morrison must have coached him, well, by golly, that's just the way it is. But respectfully, the public is not bound to see this story through the framework that they insist upon, particularly when the facts and primary evidence do not support their views. Ultimately, this topic is an academic one, and one that should be governed by logic, respect for one another, and an honest desire to find the truth. Sources are readily available for anyone to review, and the public can objectively review the evidence and make up their own minds without being told what's true and what's not. So please join me in looking at the very beginning, the book Alias Billy the Kid, written by Brushy Bill's lawyer, Mr. William Vincent Morrison, but also co-written by Dr. Charles Leland Sonnichsen. Critics seem to ignore the fact that by calling Mr. Morrison a fraud, they are also implicating Dr. Sonnichsen in a fraud, also ignoring the fact that the book was published by University of New Mexico Press as an academic product. To prove this to you, let me share the foreword of the book, which has a letter from the publisher that reads as follows. Quote, "We, meaning the University of New Mexico Press, believe that this book is the product of honest research, that the facts presented as facts are facts, whether or not they support the claims based on them. On these grounds, if none other, we believe that the book merits publication. It will not convince the skeptics, yet even the most skeptical readers of the manuscript have been amazed by what Brushy Bill knew. Things never printed, things even in contradiction to the accepted stories, since proved to have been the way that Brushy Bill told them. For example, it was generally believed that there was a federal charge outstanding against Billy the Kid. Brushy Bill said the case was thrown out of court, and when the legal records were found, they proved Brushy Bill's statement." Now again, this is the position of the University of New Mexico in 1955, where they state very clearly that they believe that this book is a product of honest research. But let's get back to Dr. Sonnichsen. Dr. Sonnichsen was the dean of the graduate school at the University of Texas, El Paso, and chairman of the English department. He had earned a Master of Arts from the University of Minnesota in 1924, and both a Master of Arts and a PhD in English Literature from Harvard. He had had teaching assignments at the St. James School in Faribault, Minnesota, and at the Carnegie Institute of Technology. He was the editor of the Journal of Arizona History from 1972 to 1977, and he was also president of the Texas Folklore Society, the Western Literature Association, the Western History Association, and he was the president of the Western Writers of America. He was a longtime member of the Texas Institute of Letters and the Texas State Historical Association. Among awards he had received for his teaching and writing were the Boudin Award from Harvard, I may not have said that correctly, the Friends of the Dallas Public Library Award from the Texas Institute of Letters, and the Minnie Stevens Piper Professorship. Also the Wrangler Award from the National Cowboy Hall of Fame twice, the Golden Spur Award, and the Saddleman Award of Western Writers of America. He had also received awards of merit from the Western Historical Association and the Association for State and Local History. Now, while certainly it's true that Dr. Sonnichsen was involved in English and English literature, he was also deeply involved in the history of the West, recognized as a man of integrity and ethics, and highly regarded by everyone that knew him. It's my personal opinion that anyone would be hard-pressed to match these credentials, and so what critics will do is dishonestly represent his involvement in the book Alias Billy the Kid. They attempt to minimize his role in writing the book, and definitely minimize his role in supporting the story. And this is just not true. In fact, if you look at the frontispiece of the original Alias Billy the Kid book, there is listed a large number of academics and professionals that were engaged in the dialogue and helped bring the book to the public. This is obviously not a fraud, but an honest academic process to bring these facts to the public. And finally, we come to the statement of U.S. President Harry S. Truman. Mr. Morrison sent the very first copy of Alias Billy the Kid to Mr. Truman, and Mr. Truman responded as follows. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I can't tell you how very much I appreciate the #1 copy of Alias Billy the Kid. I've read it from cover to cover, and it's one of the most interesting documents I have run across. I have read a great many of the things written about him and other Westerners, including The Great and the Desperados, and this book is the most satisfactory arrangement with supporting documents that I have seen." End quote. Now, critics will say that the president is just responding to one of thousands of letters sent to him, and that he was just being nice, and this doesn't indicate that he actually believes that Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid. However, what they don't know is Mr. Morrison and President Truman continued a dialogue, and in this very same letter that I just shared with you, the former president says the following, quote, "It's too bad the old man who called himself Billy the Kid could not have lived long enough to see another governor of New Mexico. He might have received a just decision." End quote. Now, obviously, for Truman to say he may have received a, quote, just decision the second time would mean that he didn't receive a, quote, just decision the first time when his claim was rejected. In other words, Truman is indicating that after reading Alias Billy the Kid from cover to cover, he was either convinced that Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid, or at minimum, he believed that the case was not heard fairly and deserved a reasonable consideration and due process. By using the words he used, he is essentially taking Morrison's side against the governor of New Mexico and lamenting that Brushy didn't get the opportunity to go in front of another governor that hopefully would have handled the case correctly. This is a far cry from the allegations of fraud against Mr. Morrison and clearly shows that he believed Mr. Morrison was acting in integrity and deserved a fair hearing. As I mentioned, what critics also don't know is that Truman stayed in touch with Mr. Morrison, sending him multiple handwritten letters, not form letters, and even inviting him to the opening of his presidential library. Now, obviously, none of this proves that Brushy Bill Roberts was really Billy the Kid. But what it does prove is that this is a serious academic exercise and not a fraud. It also shows that arguments that attack the person trying to engage in academic dialogue are the enemy of the truth. But history shows that eventually the truth will come out one way or the other. So far, the story of Brushy Bill Roberts has sustained for over 70 years. And as more time passes, more primary evidence is discovered that seems to support the story of the old cowboy from Hyco, Texas. In my personal experience, the vast majority of people that look at the story without bias are very open to the possibility that Brushy Bill could have been Billy the Kid. As for whether or not this question will ever be solved for sure, I would say at this point, with the mountain of evidence available for consideration, that that's up to the individual person to decide for themselves.